Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to unravel a royal mystery one that starts with silk sheets, a gold-leafed goblet, and a sleepy king who trusted all the wrong people. Picture this. Candlelight dancing along stone walls. A palace so silent you could hear the wax drip. Somewhere above, a silver moon cuts across the window panes like a blade. The king of Morvain is settling in for bed, and though he doesn't know it, someone is watching him closer than his guards, quieter than his own breath. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise. And let's get down to business tonight. The king's name was Edrin II, nicknamed the Sleepwalker by jesters and poets for his fondness of nighttime wandering. But tonight, he wasn't going anywhere. He was old, tired, heavy with the kind of peace that feels like a mistake. He sat by the hearth in his private solar, cradling his nightcap, a warm mixture of honeyed mead, nutmeg, and crushed poppy seed, his usual, prepared by no one but his personal steward. Except tonight, the steward was ill. Also they claimed. So someone else prepared it. Enter Courtier Caldus, the man whose hands were too soft for swordplay, but whose eyes always seemed to have a thought ahead of everyone else. He wore gloves indoors, always smiled too quickly, and tonight he volunteered to deliver the nightcap himself. Majesty, Caldus said, bowing low, I thought it best not to disturb your evening with kitchen hands. I brewed it myself. King Edrin barely looked up. Very good. Outside, the corridors darkened. The lamps snuffed out one by one. The servants retreated behind their walls like chess pieces returning to their boss. But Caldus remained, hovering just beyond the door frame even after the goblet was passed. And here's where it gets soft round the edges. The records say the king drank, that he gave a slow, satisfied sigh, that he murmured a prayer to the old saints and lay down in silence. But one account just one notes that before closing his eyes, the king looked up and said, You've never brought it warm before. That's it. No scream. No alarm. Just a simple line. Easily overlooked. Historians still debate whether Caldus tampered with the drink. The recipe was never recorded in detail, and any testing of residue was done too late. But some argue the real betrayal wasn't in the drink itself, it was in the watching, the staying, the way Caldus didn't leave when everyone else did. Outside, snow began to fall. In the east tower, the bells chimed the hour, and inside the king's chamber, nothing moved but breath and dreams. Now. If you know court life, you know nothing ever happens alone. Betrayals ripple. So while the king slept, other pieces began to shift. In the kitchens, someone noticed that the herbal ledger was missing 2 lines of entries. One for valerian root, one for belladonna plants that do not belong in a bedtime drink, unless the bedtime is permanent. Elsewhere, a servant boy was sent with a message to the queen's handmaiden, only to be told she was otherwise engaged. The same boy later claimed he saw Caldus walking not toward his chamber, but down the lower stairs toward the crypt chapel. Now, what was Caldus doing there? No one knows. Or rather, too many people pretend they don't. But a faded drawing exists in the corner of a monk's journal, made the same night. It shows 2 figures by candlelight, one seated, one kneeling, a chalice between them, a ritual, a pact. Hard to say, but it's not the only oddity. That same night, the court astrologer, yes, they still had those reported that Mars had moved into retrograde. This, he insisted, meant violence was imminent. He also noted that the king's star had dimmed, but brighter flames now burned round it. He was laughed at the next morning by everyone except Coldus. Now here's the joke. The royal hounds wouldn't stop barking that night, normally docile. They clawed at the doors to the royal wing for hours later. One servant would recall. They acted like something was already dead. We'll never know exactly what passed between the king's last conscious moment and the dawn. But we do know Coldus didn't sleep. Several guards noted him pacing in the gallery, stopping now and then to stare at portraits of old kings. And when they asked if he needed anything, he simply replied, "No, not yet." So what was that yet? That's where we'll pick up next time, with the shadows behind the tapestries and the words no one was meant to hear. But for now, let's pause here in this one, Golden Chamber, where a king drifts toward dreams with poison on his breath and betrayal curled at his feet. Don't wake him just yet. Behind every great betrayal is a whisper, not a shout, not a sword. Just the smallest sound, soft enough to slip through the cracks in the stone, but sharp enough to split a kingdom in half. In the weeks leading up to the king's long sleep, strange things started happening in the quieter corners of the palace. Not in the throne room or the war council, those places were too loud to watch, but in the linen corridors, the pantry alleys, the chapel stairwells, the hidden spine of the palace. There, courtier Coldus began to do what he did best. Talk. It wasn't treasonous at first, just commentary. A raised brow here. Can you believe His Majesty forgot the steward's name? Their jokes, light things, feathers on the wind. And it worked. Servants began repeating the little lines. King Edron's memory isn't what it was. He never used to nap so long. Doesn't he sleep through council meetings now? Soon enough. It wasn't just the lower ranks memory. The Queen's Chamberlain made a passing remark about the king's limp getting worse. A captain of the guard told his lieutenant to keep an eye on Coldus. He's the only one the king still trusts. And Coldus, he just smiled. Always just smiled. Now here's the twist. He wanted to be seen. He left doors ajar, whispered in alcoves where the stone echoed, let his words fall onto ears that were far too eager to believe them. Historians still debate whether he was acting alone or part of a larger conspiracy. Some claim he was merely a vessel, an empty cup filled with someone else's poison. Others believe he was the architect from the beginning, laying groundwork like a gardener planting nightshade among the roses. Either way, the effect was the same. Doubt began to bloom, and nothing blooms in a castle like suspicion. One particularly telling moment came during the Feast of St. Avalon, an annual banquet, usually joyous, lit with honey candles and mulled wine. But this year, the king arrived late, his gait slower than usual, his voice hoarse. He raised a goblet to toast and forgot the name of his own son-in-law. Gasps? No, too polite for that. But a pause cold. Brittle. Later that evening, Coldus was spotted leaning beside a tapestry near the Queen's gallery, speaking softly to the Duke of Avari. The Duke, known for his love of chess and hatred of idleness, nodded slowly. When he walked away, his expression had changed. A servant overheard a single line from Coldus as the Duke disappeared down the hall. Isn't it cruel to let a man keep power when he's forgotten how to hold it? Not an accusation, a mercy. A kindness. Poison with a ribbon tied round it. The court's rhythms began to shift. Scribes started copying more council notes than usual. The royal heralds delayed announcements pending review. Even the musicians at supper started playing slower tunes, less dancing, more silence. And somewhere in the silence, Coldus kept working. There's a rather charming anecdote, charming in a bleak way, about how Coldus began leaving small notes in the library books, marginalia. They call it tiny inked phrases like, "Does he still remember this battle?" Beside old histories, Or was this the last year he could ride? Next to royal portraits. One scholar eventually burnt all the pages he found defaced. But not before copying a few lines into his journal. My personal favorite. Even kings dream of someone else wearing the crown. Funny, right? But not everyone was so easily swayed. There were holdouts. The master of the hunt, for instance, reportedly threatened to gut the next man who called the king slow. And the royal tutor, the same one who taught Edrin to read at age 5, confronted Caldus in the rose garden, slapping him across the face with a rolled-up charter. Caldus didn't flinch. He simply said, "Loyalty is admirable, tutor, but so is clarity. We must all learn when to stop reciting old lessons." One of those old lessons was the doctrine of divine rule, you know? The idea that a king is chosen by heaven and only heaven can remove him. But Caldus wasn't arguing with heaven. He was convincing people that heaven had changed its mind. So what does betrayal look like in the beginning? Not knives, not screaming, just a phrase repeated too often. He needs rest, just a question asked too politely. Have you noticed he trembles now? Just a plan made without him, only until he wakes. Of course, the joke, because there has to be one, is that Caldus reportedly never lied. He just asked questions. He just pointed out things people already feared were true. Then he stood back and watched the firelight do the rest, daughter, and remember those tapestries, the ones he always stood near. One night, a maid dropped a candlestick and pulled the edge of one down, trying to catch herself. Behind it, a small hole in the wall, a speaking hole, a relic from older times, when spies listened through stone. It led to the king's chamber. Who used it? We'll get to that. But for now, let's leave Caldus exactly where he liked to be, behind the curtain, watching as the first cracks widened across the crowd. The king still sleeps, but now, the whispers round him have teeth. In any palace worth its salt or secrets, there's always a room no one talks about. It's not the war chamber, not the bedchamber, not even the wine cellar, though that one comes close. No, this room was smaller, quieter, locked, always a place where only the king and his most trusted hand were allowed. They called it the scroll room, but it was less about scrolls, more about silence. Here is where letters came and vanished. Missives from distant lords, reports from spies, pleas from peasants. And every now and then, something personal like the one that went missing the week before the betrayal. Let's talk about that letter. It wasn't sealed with royal wax, but with a smaller sigil. A weeping willow, ringed in stars. Only a few knew what it meant. Fewer still dared to touch it. But someone did. The letter had been locked, sorted, set aside for the king's midnight review. Then, by morning, it was gone. Not misplaced, not misfiled, just missing. Now normally, this would cause a flurry of activity. Guards, search, a royal summons. But not this time. Instead, the Chamberlain Sir Anselm, an aging man with a fondness for pipeweed and punctuality, was found asleep at his desk. Strange in itself, stranger still, the opening quell, the faint smear of black across his palm, the blotch on his cuff, and stranger still than that, the message on the floor. It wasn't a full letter, just 3 words, scribbled hurriedly in Old Morvanese, then crossed out again and again. He won't know. Who was he? The king. Caldus. Someone else. Historians still debate it. Now. Here's where it gets slipperier than eel soup at a wedding. Sir Anselm, after waking, had no memory of writing anything. He claimed he never touched the king's correspondence, claimed he'd been tired from the saint's feast, went to lie down, and woke up hours later in his own chair. No one believed him. But no one proved otherwise, you see. The scroll room had only one key, and it was kept on the king's belt. But 1 week earlier, Caldas had been seen adjusting that belt, fixing a clasp. He said, a simple act of loyalty, right? Let's sprinkle in a little salt. The steward who reported the missing letter vanished 3 days later. Vanished as in quit without notice, left a note about family matters, and was never seen again. CL, the US reportedly said. He always did seem overwhelmed by paper. Now remember, this isn't a story about bold decorations or midnight duels. This is slow, patient. The kind of betrayal you can mistake for a kindness. Which brings us to the oddest part of this whole scroll affair. You'd think a lost letter would be a footnote. But then, 2 days after its disappearance, the king was overheard asking, did my sisters and boy ever arrive? Of course, Edron's sister had been dead for 10 years. The room froze. A cough covered the silence. And Caldas, bless him, leaned in and said, no, Majesty. Perhaps the letter was delayed. And with that, the moment passed. But not for everyone. Later that night, a young clerk named Mida found a torn corner of parchment behind the chimney grate. It was brittle, charred, barely legible. But one phrase stood out. Should not trust him with the cup. There it is again. The cup. The same word whispered after the midsummer feast. The same one Caldas delivered to the king's hand with too much care. Funny how things echo. Now, you might think Mida brought this scrap to the council. She the ID in single quotes instead. She buried it under a floorboard in the Northern Library, where it was found 70 years later by a restoration team. You can still see it today in the Royal Archive of Morvain, faded, scorched, and pressed between glass. Historians love it. They gather round and argue. Was it written by the Queen, the steward, his spy? Was it even about Caldas? And my favorite theory, that it was written by the king himself. Maybe not as a warning, but as a test, a decoy, a breadcrumb for anyone clever enough to follow it. Because here's something else. Edron wasn't stupid. Yes, slower than he used to be. But there's a reason he survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 civil uprisings, and a poison-laced pudding in his youth. He knew how betrayal worked. He just didn't expect it to come with such a soft voice. The real joke, when the castle archivist was asked about the missing scroll, he replied, that probably just misfire. Happens all the time. Then he paused, looked round, and whispered, unless it was meant to be lost. You see, not everything that disappears in a castle is gone for good. Some things are tucked away, hidden, waiting. And in the silence that followed the lost letter, courtier Caldas began visiting the scroll room more often. He never stayed long, never took anything, just stood there. Like he was waiting for something. Or someone. So tonight, let's close the iron-bound door, leave the room cold and dark, and imagine the faint scratching of ink on paper, long after everyone else has gone to bed. Sleep tight, King Edron. The words are already moving without you. The Queen's smile wasn't especially warm, nor especially cold. It was the kind of smile that sat just on the edge of understanding, half-formed, slow, and measured, like she knew exactly how far it would travel before someone started asking questions. And she gave that smile to Caldas, just once, during the spring reconciliation feast, an annual affair meant to convince all the noble houses that no one was plotting against anyone, which, historically, has never worked. The Queen sat beside King Edron, as tradition demanded, her crown tilted delicately over her left brow. The king, already half lulled by wine and soft music, barely touched his food. His eyes drooped, his fingers trembled once, then stilled. And Caldas, courtier Caldas, stood just 4 places down the table, in the half-shadow of a carved pillar, waiting, watching. Then it happened. The Queen turned her head not toward her husband, not toward the harvest, but directly toward Caldas. She smiled, 1 second, maybe 2. But it rippled down the length of the hall like a knife dropped into a pond. 3 lords noticed. One guard looked away in that very specific way guards do when they see something they're not supposed to. Historians still debate the meaning of that movement. Some say it was acknowledgement and understanding passed in silence. Others say it was a warning, a final test, or perhaps it was simply recognition, like seeing your own shadow behaving differently. No one knows. But what followed was stranger still. That night, after the feast, the queen retired to her private apartment, so that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that her handmaidens were dismissed. All of them. Only one Jessa. Barely 17 remained behind to tidy up the dining hall. She would later recall passing the queen's door and seeing it cracked open. Just a little. Enough to see flickering candlelight and one silhouette seated. UNMOVING.JESSA didn't stop. Just kept walking. But she heard something. A second voice. Male.soft. Familiar. Colorless. She wouldn't say. But the next morning, that same door was closed. The queen emerged wearing gloves. Her smile was gone, and on her vanity, though this detail was scrubbed from the official inventory, a single lock of dark hair had been placed in a glass vial. Why? Well, let's just say this. Old royal households had a habit of preparing for more than coronations. Some families kept ashes, others kept teeth. The queen, she kept hair, not her own. A superstition, a promise, an insurance policy. All 3. Maybe Dot now hears something most people miss. That same week, a duplicate set of royal keys went missing. The blacksmith insisted he never made extras. The steward denied authorization, and yet a month later, the queen's private chamber was found unlocked after a thunderstorm rattled the southern windows open. Nothing stolen, nothing moved, except the pillows had been turned over. And the bed, typically pristine, had one long crease down the middle, as if someone had lain beside her for hours. She never reported it. Instead, she started walking the gardens at dawn. Alone. Let single quotes as sprinkle in an auditive or flavor. There's an entry from a stable boy's journal, yes. They kept journals. Who else was going to write the history? That reads, saw Her Majesty in the orchard, talking to herself. Said, don't do it yet. Let him have one more night. The boy didn't tell anyone until years later, when the palace had changed hands, and the old secrets were just harmless stories told over bread and cheap ale. And here's the twist of the blade. Queen Adrienne was no fool. She came from a line of women who survived coups, bad harvests, and worse husbands. She knew the smell of rot before the fruit even soured. So the real question isn't did she know what Coldus was doing. It's did she help, or did she simply let it happen? There's a peculiar letter, and signed but widely believed to be from the Queen, found in the spine of a hollowed-out prayer book. Just 3 lines. The lion does not rule before the strike. Let him sleep. Let them blame the snake. Poetic. Yes, also chilling. Now, if you're wondering whether the Queen loved her husband well, love in palaces is complicated. It's not about roses and moonlight. It's about power, control, and sometimes release. Edrin had ruled for nearly 3 decades. He was never cruel, but he was never kind either. Not in the way people needed. And over time, even the most golden crowns begin to feel heavy. So maybe the Queen smiled at Coldus because she recognized a man doing the inevitable. Or maybe, just maybe, she smiled because she'd already handed him the knife. One final whisper from this chapter. A week after the king's sleep began, the Queen left a sachet of crushed lavender and rosemary on his nightstand. Not unusual, but tucked inside, a lock of his hair. Bound with silver thread. Some say it was a blessing. Others call it a curse. Let's not guess too loudly. Instead, Drift with us now into the fading candlelight. Imagine the sound of soft footsteps across velvet rugs. Imagine a woman pausing at the edge of her sleeping husband's bed and smiling. Just once. The feast was supposed to be a celebration, a ritual of renewal, a festival of lanterns and second chances. They called it the Feast of Flickering Lights, held once every 7 years when the moon sat directly above the rose spire of the palace. It was said that during such a night, any lie whispered beneath the stained glass stone would turn to ash by dawn. This year, the moon was early. The court gathered with a mix of reverence and weariness. Nobles dressed in linen and purple, jesters painted in gleaming gold dust, and pages carrying trays of steaming venison and spiced bread. The hall shimmered with thousands of little lanterns, each flame flickering inside colored glass, throwing fractured rainbows onto the polished stone floor. But outside, a storm stirred. The kind of storm that didn't knock politely. The kind that crouched low, waited for the music to swell, and then struck. Thunder boomed just as the harpist began his solo. The lanterns trembled, a few dimmed. One shattered, sending sparks into the air like fireflies fleeing a forest. That was when people started noticing the wine. It was subtle at first. A wrinkled nose, a sniff. Then to nobles near the east, days stood up and walked away from there and touched goblets, whispering to each other with furrowed brows. CALDUS, of course, remained still. He didn't drink that night, claimed he had a fasting vow for the ancestors, which no one had ever heard him mention before. Meanwhile, King Edron, blissfully unaware, had already drained his cup. Red wine, laced with clove and elderberry. Also they thought, until someone said, "Does that taste like fennel?" And someone else replied, "No, more like almonds." Historians still debate whether the wine was ever truly tainted. No one died, no one fainted. But 5 different nobles reported nausea. One reportedly claimed she forgot her own name for 3 full minutes. The steward in charge of the wine resigned the next morning, moved to a monastery, took a vow of silence. Suspicious. You decide. But here's where it really starts to crack. In the chaos of the storm, as the rain lashed the stained glass windows, the queen leaned over and whispered something into the king's ear. He didn't respond, not out of rudeness. He simply didn't hear her, or didn't understand. Later, she would be seen gripping the stem of her goblet so tightly it cracked between her fingers. She didn't flinch, just dabbed at her handkerchief and placed it calmly on her plate, as if blood were just another source. Meanwhile, a servant named Eric, remember that name, was tasked with retrieving a fresh bottle from the cellar. He returned 30 minutes late, his tunic soaked, his hands trembling. He never explained why, but weeks later, when the cellar was inventoried, a secret passage was discovered behind a shelf of moldy apricot preserves, leading where? To the crypt stairwell. And the crypt, you'll recall, had one recent visitor. Call-less, coincidence, sure. Let's call it that. Now. About that goblet. It disappeared. The one the king drank from silver. Wolf head engraving. A gift from the Ovary house 5 years prior, was missing by the end of the night. Searched for, never found. Some believe it was smuggled out by callers. Others claim the queen had it melted down the next day and recast into a pendant she wore only once. A tiny circle, plain, shiny dot when asked what it was. She said, "Just something to help me remember." Here's a fun aside. During that same feast, the royal astrologer stood up, unprompted, and announced that Jupiter had entered a house of betrayal. He said this as the roast duck was being served, ruining several appetites and all the courtly small talk. He was asked to sit down. He did, then muttered, "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." He died 3 years later choking on a cherry pit, possibly symbolic. Definitely unfortunate. So, what happened in the aftermath of the feast? Paranoia. The kitchens were purged. The wine cellar sealed. The queen summoned a new taster, an orphan girl from the southern provinces with a tongue rumored to detect trace poisons. That girl later disappeared too. But we'll get there. The king. He slept deeply that night. Deeper than usual. When the queen came to wake him the next morning, he murmured something unintelligible, smiled faintly, and drifted back to sleep. She didn't try again. Instead, she walked to the window and opened it wide. Let the cold in. Let the storm in. And down below, somewhere in the corridors of the castle, Coldus sat in the library's shadow alcove, writing something in a book with no title. If you ever find that book, don't read it too fast. Some stories are better whispered, or left half told. And as thunder fades behind us, and the lanterns flicker their last, let's remember the sound of a goblet setting softly on stone, or not setting at all. Castles creak when no one's watching. That's the first thing you notice when sleep doesn't come, and the night stretches long like an empty hallway. The stones don't groan, they breathe. And on the night after the Feast of Flickering Lights, someone was walking through those breaths, slowly, silently. Bare feet. Courtier Coldus, if the guard accounts are to be believed, was seen crossing the northern corridor long past midnight. No shoes, no candle, just the dim halo of moonlight on polished floor and the sound of fabric brushing old stone. He shouldn't have been there. That wing was reserved for the outer chambermaids and the monastery scribes. No one with silk sleeves or signet rings had business in those halls. But there he was, and he wasn't alone. Because that night, a strange thing happened. A child, one of the palace orphans, was caught sneaking apples from the pantry. She was punished, yes, but she was also asked a simple question. Did you see anyone else? She nodded, then said, man walking like he didn't want to wake the ghosts. Poetic, right? Kids are creepy like that. But that wasn't all. She said the man passed through the iron hallway that led to the Sorrow Stairs. Now, the Sorrow Stairs are legend, an unused spiral carved straight into the bedrock beneath the castle. They twist downward, tight and narrow, like the inside of a conch shell. No torches, no bells. They were sealed after Queen Marita supposedly fell to her death there in year 176 of the Fling calendar. So what was Coldus doing near them? And more importantly, how did he get in? One theory is that the queen gave him the spare key. Another says he carved his own. He did have a background in metallurgy. After all, a little-known fact buried under layers of poetry and forged papers. But here's what's known. 3 nights after the feast, one of the wall torches along that same corridor was found burned down to the stub. A single strand of silk green, hemmed with gold, was caught in the sconce bracket. Coldus's robe. Now, to be clear, he wasn't caught. That would be too easy. But a curious guard, spooked by the torch and the fabric, followed the trail down through the archive floor, past the laundry cellars, right to the edge of the crypt passage. He stopped there because he heard something. Not voices, not footsteps, breathing, not human, low, raspy, rhythmic, like a bellows made of bones. He fled. Told no one for days. Eventually, he confessed to the queen's confessor, who, conveniently, was deaf and recorded nothing. That's how this story works, a thread of truth tied to a knot of silence. Still, the rumor spread that Coldus was practicing necromancy, that he was consulting the dead kings, that he was looking for something below something older than the crown. One archivist claimed Coldus was seeking the bastard ledger mythical book listing every royal child born in secret, hidden or silence. A book said to be sealed beneath the Sorrow Stairs, bound in wolfskin, written in a hand that wasn't quite human. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's another possibility. That Coldus wasn't going down the stairs to find something. He was going there to talk, to whisper, to confess. Because there's a single scroll fragment, preserved behind a cracked sconce in the west gallery. That reads, "If I speak aloud, they will know. But the stone listens, the dead forget." Spooky, yes, but also logical. If Coldus truly believed the walls were safer than men, then speaking into the dark was the most honest thing he could do. And maybe, just maybe, something spoke back. That week, multiple servants began complaining of dreams, vivid ones, always of stairwells, always descending, always ending with a door that wouldn't open. One cook claimed she heard someone say her name in her sleep, a name she hadn't used in 20 years, her maiden name. Now, here's the historical footnote that makes this even weirder. Centuries earlier, King Eden the Mad ordered a tunnel carved beneath the palace, a tunnel meant to talk to the worms. Everyone laughed, assumed it was metaphor, but records show a strange expense logged in the royal treasury. 200 lanterns to be buried beneath, where, guess, same spiral stairwell, same crypt base. So when Coldus began hunting those same passages, it wasn't just suspicious. It was familiar, a repeating pattern. And maybe that's why the Queen didn't stop him, because history always loops back on itself, like barefoot steps in dust, circling. Here's one last breadcrumb. The king began murmuring in his sleep. Not full words, just fragments. He's beneath. Wrong cup. Don't let them seal it. Nurses documented these phrases, then stopped. Ordered not to record. By whom? Guess again. So let's walk quietly now, past the rows of extinguished sconces, down the whispering stairs, past the place where the stone breathes, and follow the bare feet of a courtier who wasn't looking for escape, but an answer. Some people leave warnings carved into stone. Others use blood. The archivist at Morvain used it. Old ink, darker than soot, thicker than sap, stored in a goat horn flask and sealed with wax so ancient it flaked like snow. And one night, long before the king's sleep, that archivist came out of retirement to write a single scroll. It wasn't meant for the king. It wasn't even meant for the living. But someone read it. The archivist's name was Orlin, and he was, how to say this kindly, exactly the kind of man you'd expect to live inside a library tower for 30 years and forget what day it was. He smelled like parchment. He muttered dates in his sleep. He once corrected a royal sermon because the chronology of the saint was off by 2 centuries, but Orlin knew things. He'd lived through 5 reigns. He'd seen one king fall off a horse, another fall to scandal, and a third fall asleep and never quite wake up. Sound familiar? That's why he came back. He wasn't summoned. He just showed up one foggy morning with an old cedar box and a look like he hadn't blinked in 3 days. He asked for one thing: access to the royal genealogy vault. They gave it to him, who was going to argue. 3 days later, he emerged with a scroll. Not new, not old, something in between. It had no royal seal, no title, just a plain label, handed him. If this has happened before and according to the single page still remaining, it had once 200 years earlier. A king named Aldredfor, also known as the Dreaming Wolf, reportedly fell into a sudden sleep, deep, unshakable. Lasted 3 nights. On the 4th morning, he woke, but he wasn't the same. He forgot people, repeated phrases, stopped attending council. 6 months later, he died. In his place, a regent took power, a soft-spoken advisor named Martin. Guess what house Martin belonged to? Yes, Coldus's direct line, if the chart is to be believed. Orlin wrote, in his shaky, spidery hand, "We mistake repetition for fate. But perhaps it is only that we forget how many times we've been here. He tried to give this scroll to the queen. She refused to take it, said she had no interest in fairy tales. So Orlin gave it to a passing apprentice, told him to hide it. That apprentice, later promoted by Caldus. Interesting. But there's more. A single marginal note in Orlin's scroll hints at a ritual something older than the crown, older than the throne itself. He called it the sleep bargain, the idea that a ruler could be placed into stasis, willingly or not, to prevent catastrophe, but only if someone else took their place, not a double, a vessel, someone, he wrote. To carry the burden of wakefulness, is that what Caldus was doing? Or was he the one causing the sleep? Historians still argue. Some say the scroll is fabricated, planted by loyalists to defame Caldus. Others believe it's real, and worse, it's incomplete. The second page is missing, torn out, burned, perhaps, or hidden. And here's where things get stranger than they already are. Because that same week, Caldus requested an official copy of the court's medical records, not the king's, the queen's. He claimed it was for estate planning. No one questioned him. Why would they? He had the king's trust. He had everyone's trust, except Orlin's. And when Orlin disappeared 1 week later, yes. Of course he vanished. He left behind one final clue. A line scrawled on the wall of his chamber, just above the fireplace. It isn't the first sleep that matters. It's the one no one wakes from. So what was he trying to say? That this wasn't about poison or power. That this was something repeating, something built into the stone. A curse, a custom, or just history, lazy and looping. The funny part, after Orlin's disappearance, his tower was sealed. And in the royal ledger, beside his name, someone wrote, retired again. Nice touch. Caldus, very subtle. Let's leave the ink-stained chamber now, where truth clings to the walls like mildew. Let's close the last scroll and step quietly over the threshold where paper meets prophecy. Because the king is still asleep. And somewhere, someone is reading the ending aloud, before it's even happened. What does a kingdom do when its king won't wake? Simple. It pretends he's just resting. For days, then weeks, the court is kept to the script. The king is tired. The king is meditating. The king is communing with his ancestors. Perhaps even writing a private treatise on statecraft. They sent envoys to distant provinces with chilly news. They postponed court hearings with polite apologies. And all the while, the man at the center of it all lay in his velvet-draped bed, unmoving, warm but unresponsive. Like sleep had forgotten how to let him go. The queen oversaw everything. But Caldus, he began stepping forward, not entitled. That would have been too obvious. No, he did what all clever men do. He filled the empty spaces. He stood in for the king at a ceremonial blessing. He drafted memos. He met with the city treasurer and proposed temporary fiscal moderation which, oddly, benefited his own cousin's shipping guild. Then came the delegation from Trensma, a minor border territory, sure but fiercely independent, and perpetually annoyed by the king's trade policies. When they arrived and were told they'd be received by Caldus, their reaction was mixed. According to court gossip, the Trensmeran ambassador, Lady Dareth, leaned close to the queen and whispered, "And how long will your husband sleep while his shadow rules?" The queen, without blinking, replied, "Shadows serve the sun until it sets, ambiguous, sharp, very on brand. Now here's the oddity. After that meeting, Lady Dareth left behind her traveling cloak on purpose, tucked inside the lining, a note, beware the silent coronation. Even the sun can be tricked into shining on the wrong face. It was found by a chambermaid, who gave it to the queen, who then by all accounts gave it to Caldus. He read it. smiled. Then used it as a bookmark. And that, my friends, is how betrayal becomes casual, not hidden, not urgent. One. Let's drift down now to the council room, the round one with the carved oak table that supposedly contains wood from the first royal ship. Here, the council met every week. At first, they left the king's chair empty, draped it in blue silk, lit a candle. Then someone suggested they just sit in it, just for comfort, symbolism and all that. That someone, you guessed it, C.L. the US. He only sat once, though. After that, he stood behind it, out of respect. He said, but each time, he placed one hand on the chair's carved back and never let go. Historians still debate the exact moment when he became de facto regent. There was no formal decree, no official transition. It just happened. The king did not object. Of course, he couldn't. And then came the Petition of Seven, a scroll, signed by 7 mid-level nobles, requesting that the governance of the realm be entrusted temporarily to a capable steward until such time as His Majesty regains strength. No names mentioned. No accusations, just a suggestion. But in the margins, barely visible, someone had written, no crown yet. Let the mask breathe. Coldest denied writing it, but the ink matched his ledger pen. The queen never acknowledged the screw, neither acceptance nor rejection. But she did begin attending council meetings less frequently. On the days she did attend, she wore black gloves and never touched anything. Now, here's your trivia moment for the evening. The royal scribe at the time, a man with terrible posture and a perfect memory, later claimed that Coldus began writing his own titles differently. He used to sign Coldus, voice of the inner court, but around this time, he started writing Coldus, keeper in His Majesty's silence votable. Isn't it? And terrifying. Because now silence had a custodian, and the king, still breathing, still unawake. Nurses said his pulse was steady, but his eyes flickered like someone dreaming of decisions they couldn't make. In one eerie report, his scribe wrote, today, His Majesty turned his head toward the window and smiled, as if someone stood there, but the room was empty. Or maybe not. Which brings us to the final, most unsettling event of that stretch, the cloakroom incident. One night, a guard on routine patrol passed the king's cloakroom, a room adjacent to his private chambers, used only for a ceremonial robes and winter regalia. The guard swore he heard footsteps inside. He entered empty. But the red ceremonial cloak, the one worn only for coronations, was missing from its hook. In its place, a note, folded into the shape of a crown. No ink. Just the faint trace of a fingerprint pressed into the parchment. Later tested. Not the king's, not the queen's. Coldus never allowed his to be tested. Superstition, he said. Ink and blood don't mix well. Double quotes right. So now the palace was suspended in a kind of velvet limbo. No proclamations, no executions, no parades. The king slept. The queen vanished into her gloves. And Coldus wandered the halls with a smile like a man waiting for applause after the final act, except the curtain hadn't fallen yet. Let's end here, just outside the king's chamber. The hall is quiet. The gods pretend not to hear the soft, rhythmic breaths within, and courtier Coldus pauses at the door, just for a moment, just long enough to whisper. He's still in there, but he's farther away every day. Then he walks on .uncowned. Unhurried. Unopposed. If you've ever been inside a royal chapel at dawn, you'll know the light doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps, first through the colored pane, soft blue, dull gold, saintly green, then along the pews like an apology that's come too late. And in the palace of Morvain, the chapel had remained mostly empty during the weeks of the king's sleep. except for Caldus. He visited often. Always alone, always early, always sitting in the same pew, third row from the back, left side, beneath the window of St. Aaron, the patron of patience and poisoning. That detail is real. By the way, now, he never prayed aloud, but according to one acolyte, Caldus would rest his hand on the pew in front of him and move his lips slowly, as if mouthing a name, over and over. Which name? That's the part no one agrees on. Some say it was the king's, others say it was his own. One very dramatic historian even claimed Caldus was whispering to the gods, daring them to answer. But they never did. Or maybe they did and didn't like what they heard. Because on the 9th day after the feast, a strange message was found on the chapel door. Not a note, a mark charcoal, drawn in a spiral, 3 loops. One line through the center. It wasn't a known sigil. Not roll, not religious, but it was old. Soot flakes were tested centuries later and traced to a specific kind of temple charcoal used only in funerary rites. For the silent dead. It caused a stir. Of course, the gods blamed a prank. The priests blamed heresy. The queen said nothing, and Caldus. He had the mark cleaned by dusk. But that wasn't the end of it. That same morning, 3 doves, trained ones, used for messaging, were found dead in the chapel tower, all with tiny scrolls still tied to their legs. Unreadable. Soaked by morning dew. One word was legible on one scroll. Refused again. Historians argue. Was it a denial from a noble house, a cancelled alliance, a message from beyond? And let's not forget the confession. Oh yes, there was a confession. Not by Caldus, he was far too careful for that. But by a young priest in training, who approached the queen in the garden during her morning walk. He said he'd overheard something. Not a full conversation. Just a voice familiar echoing through the stone between the chapel and the SCIPTORIUM. He quoted it as follows. He dreams still, but I have taken the waking. The queen froze, asked no further questions. Just thanked him, turned, and whispered to her handmaiden, "Send word to my brother." Quietly. That night, the priest was reassigned to a distant monastery. No explanation. His name was struck from chapel rolls. His cot was removed. The queen never visited the chapel again. Now, here's where the oddness condenses into something truly unnerving. The royal astronomer, yes. Him again charted the constellations that evening and noted something peculiar. The stars over Morvain had shifted, not physically, of course, but symbolically. The cluster of swords, normally north, had appeared closer to the chapel star. This shift, he claimed, marked a time of false anointing when power moved not by choice, nor by war, but by absence. When he brought this to Caldus's attention, Caldus laughed, then reportedly said, "Stars do not choose kings. They only remember them chilling." But not as chilling as what came next. On the 10th morning of the king's sleep, his ceremonial crown was found not on his bedside altar, where it belonged, but placed neatly at the foot of his bed. Nobody claimed to have moved it. No one saw anything. But there it was. Waiting. That day, the castle fell silent. No one played music in the halls. No one laughed. Even the birds, according to one journal entry, sang shorter songs. It was as if the entire palace had held its breath, and Caldus, he disappeared for one full day. Gone. No sightings, no notes, no slippers by the door. When he returned the next morning, he entered the chapel again. Same pew, same posture. But this time, a witness, a widow named Berth, who had come to light a candle, said he wasn't mouthing words anymore. He was mouthing numbers. Counting. Up or down. She couldn't tell. But when she passed by his pew to leave, she swears he looked at her and said, "Almost finished." So here we are, in the flickering candlelight of that empty chapel. The stained glass glows with memories, the pews creak. And in the third row, beneath the saint of poison ink, a man who is not yet king counts something only he understands, and behind the altar, in the crypt vaults no longer sealed, something ancient begins to breathe slower, not dead, just waiting. There's a corridor in the west wing they used to call the Hall of Mirrors, but it never had mirrors, just polished obsidian panels set from floor to ceiling, so smooth, so dark. They reflected everything with a kind of dream logic. Images shifted, phases walked, torches danced behind you. Even if none were lit. It was King Edrin's favorite hall. He said it made the castle feel like it had a second soul. And when he stopped walking, when the sleep took hold, no one walked it again. Except Coles. That's where the queen found him. It was dusk candlelight hour. When the corridors softened at the edges, she entered quietly, her steps feathered by slippered feet. No retinue, no gloves tonight. Just her, a thin shawl, and the silence of someone who no longer needed to pretend. Coldus didn't turn round. He stood at the far end of the hall, one hand pressed flat against the obsidian wall, staring at his own reflection. Only it wasn't quite his. Reflections lie in that corridor. They shimmer, they blur. Some say they show the you would have been if you'd taken the other path. When the queen spoke, she didn't raise her voice. Did you think I wouldn't notice? He said nothing, but his fingers curled slightly against the stone. She stepped closer. The missing ledger, the borrowed ink, the acolyte, the birds, still. Nothing. So she tried a different weapon. He dreamed of you before this, and that finally turned him. He didn't deny it. He just looked at her with that same maddening calm and said, he saw what had to be done. That's what dreams are. Permission. Let's pause here to add a touch of unease, because this exchange wasn't recorded in any official ledger. But there was a painter, one of the royal artists, sketching the shadows in the east alcove of the hall. A study of light for a tapestry commission. He saw the whole thing, didn't breathe, didn't blink, and years later, in exile, he recreated the scene in charcoal. The queen called this. The obsidian behind them warped into smoke. He called it what we leave behind us. The original was banned. Burned. But a copy exists now. Back to our mirrored conversation. The queen asked him very simply, why. Not in the political sense. In the human one. Why betray the one man who trusted him? And Coldus, with less malice than you'd expect, said, he trusted me to speak when he could not. So I did. There's a cruelty to logic, isn't there? The queen stepped closer. Her reflection flickered beside his taller, sharper, wearing a crown she never wanted. She said, you've stolen his kingdom. Coldus shook his head. No, he gave it to sleep. I'm just holding the light. Poetic. Arrogant. Possibly both. And then came the moment. Historians still whisper about the moment neither of them moved. The air thick, the obsidian dark. Their two reflections standing side by side, impossibly still, until the queen did something unexpected. She laughed. Just once. Not loud, not cruel. A tired, genuine laugh. The kind that escapes when you realize the worst thing you feared already happened and you're still here. You'll be alone, she said. Coldus nodded. I already am. Then she walked past him. Never looked back, and he stayed there. Another hour, maybe two. People passed, pretended not to see him. The shadows held him gently, like a final lullaby before dusk turned to night. Let's end this moment here, in the hall with no mirrors. Just reflections, two rulers, neither crown, both watching themselves disappear. In the colder wings of the palace, those halls where tapestries hung more for insulation than beauty servants began to speak in lowered voices, not about the king, not even about Coldus, about the air. It feels different. One of the older stewards whispered as he polished the brass rail. Heavier, like it's listening. A scullery maid refused to enter the linen tower without humming. Said silence in that room now felt wrong, like stepping into someone's mouth. And at the heart of it all was a room no one dared enter anymore. The king's chamber. By now, the visits had stopped. No more physicians, no more priests. The queen sent a single attendant, always the same girl. Always in blue. She would enter at sunrise, stay exactly 7 minutes, and leave with a pale expression and hands that trembled for hours after dot. So what was happening inside? The king still breathed. That much everyone agreed on. But other things began to shift. The flowers by his bed never wilted. A cracked window pane, shattered during a storm, was mysteriously mended overnight, though no one was assigned the repair. And just once a god swore he saw a light. Not candlelight, not moonlight, but something faint, golden, pulsing from beneath the king's door like a heartbeat made visible. He quit the next day. Now grows figs in the north provinces. Won't speak of it. Meanwhile, Coldus grew bold. He began delivering edicts, not from the throne but from the reading balcony. A modest overlook in the central court, usually reserved for poetry competitions and marriage announcements. That's where he stood, 3 times a week, parchment in hand, voice calm and clear as morning frost. By His Majesty's will, let the grain tide be adjusted. By His Majesty's silence, let the roads to Transmere be closed. By His Majesty's rest, let the taxes on salt be lifted. That phrase, by His Majesty's rest, began to appear everywhere. In court memos, in city decrees, in children's rhymes. And the people, they obeyed. Why wouldn't they? Life went on. The city gates stayed open. The streets were clean. Bread was delivered on time. And if the king preferred sleep to speeches, well, some said that wasn't the worst kind of ruler. Better a dreaming lion than a snarling fool. One merchant was overheard saying, but there were murmurs. In the west markets, pamphlets began appearing, unmarked, mysterious. They showed a crown tilted sideways and a pair of hands holding it, not placing it on a head, not removing it. Just holding. Beneath the image, the question, who speaks when kings sleep too long? Coldus had the pamphlets collected, quietly, no rests. Just a shift in the guards' patrols, a new gate tax, the usual pressure. But the queen began to write. Letters. She wrote dozens, all on thick parchment, sealed with her personal crest. No royal wax, no state markings. Only one letter was ever recovered. It read, he dreams in symbols, he whispers in echoes, and still they call it peace. To whom she wrote it? Unknown. Some say it was to her brother. Others believe she wrote them for herself. Knowing the palace, eyes watched every move. But it didn't matter, because something else was happening now. The sleep was spreading. Two gods fell asleep during their watch. Not dozing, sleeping. Full-bodied, still-faced, unshakable sleep. They awoke the next day with no memory. One of them wept uncontrollably for an hour, claimed he saw a staircase made of breath. One cook fell asleep stirring soup. The soup burnt. The ladle melted. The cook never woke. And in the eastern wing, where the seamstresses worked, a tapestry was found, unfinished, half-spun but showing, unmistakably, a man asleep in a tower, while a crowd knelt outside, faces blank. The seamstress responsible disappeared. The queen said nothing. Neither did Coldus. But the reading balcony fell silent for a week. When Coldus returned, he wore darker robes and spoke fewer words. by His Majesty's rest. Let mourning be optional, by His Majesty's rest. Let history wait. One old historian, our friend Orland's last apprentice, scribbled this in the margin of his records. We've begun to live as if waking is treason. Let's walk now, quietly, down the softened halls, past the lanterns that dim a little more each night, past the guards who do not blink, past the Queen's door, where a single candle burns, untouched, and let's pause outside the King's chamber, not to listen, not even to knock, just to stand, and wonder. What happens when the kingdom forgets what its king's voice sounds like? What happens when we all begin to dream with him? By now, no one questioned it. The king slept. The queen withdrew. Coldness ruled. But something beneath the rhythm of palace life began to shift, a kind of subterranean unease. Like walking across floorboards, are hollow. And then the bells rang. The bells in Morvain were ancient, only rung for births, coronations, and death this morning. They rang 13 times. The sound cracked across the city like thunder wrapped in gold. People paused mid-step, dropped baskets, crossed themselves without knowing why. No death had been announced. No birth registered. No coronation declared. And yet the bells rang. CLUS. It should be noted, was not in the palace when it happened. He'd gone to the southern cliffs for a private audience with the keeper of the beacon, an old tradition involving sea charts and weather omens. Convenient timing. No, by the time he returned, the city was humming with unease. No one claimed to have rung the bells. The bell wardens denied it, said they'd been asleep. Not dozing. Asleep. 3 of them were found still slumped at their posts, their hands folded neatly over their chests. Not dead, just somewhere else. When they woke, they wept, not out of fear, out of grief. They couldn't say for whom that evening. The Queen appeared publicly for the first time in nearly a week. She walked alone into the great hall, dressed not in mourning, but in white, ivory silk, a gown she hadn't worn since the king's coronation. She said nothing, just stood beneath the rose-glass dome, where the moonlight spilled like softened ice, and held something high in her hand. A crown, but not the ceremonial one, not the one that had rested beside the king's bed. This one was older, wrought iron, twisted, simple, forged during the founding years when kings ruled by oath, not by blood. And she said, in a voice that echoed to the very rafters, "No man wears this unless the kingdom bleeds." Then she lowered it, placed it on the floor, and walked away. The next morning, it was gone. Now, did she expect callers to see this gesture? Of course, and he did. His response came, as always, on parchment, a missive delivered to every noble house, every steward, every city gate. A single phrase, repeated, "The crown waits. Let it wait." People debated its meaning. Was it refusal? Acceptance? A riddle? In the old tongue, "Let it wait" can also be translated as "prepare the silence." And in this kingdom, silence had become policy. That same day, a new position was created. Warden of the Still Hours, a ceremonial title, supposedly meant to oversee the royal archives, but the appointee had a background in sleep medicine. Subtle. By nightfall, 7 new royal guards were posted outside the king's chamber, not to keep people out. To keep something in. One of them, a boy barely 17, reportedly muttered in his sleep, "He walks inside the dream now." Not alone. No one dared wake him. The Queen, meanwhile, took to writing letters again. Only this time, they weren't sealed. She left them on palace benches, on stair rails, on the tray beside her, and touched meals. Each one began the same way. If you read this, you have not yet surrendered. Each ended differently. He is not dead. He is becoming. The dream is not his, it's ours. When he returns, We will not remember who we were. Eventually, Coldus addressed it Dot at his next appearance on the reading balcony. He held up one of the letters. Read it aloud Dot, then burned it in his hand Dot. No words, just fire, and a look not angry, not triumphant Dot, tired Dot, like a man who had walked through 1,000 doors and finally found the one that didn't open. That night, a window in the Queen's Tower shattered Dot. No storm, no impact, just a slow, quiet break glass slipping like tears onto the floor Dot. In the morning, she was gone Dot. No sign of force Dot. No sign of flight, just an empty robe folded on the bed, and a faint trace of lavender oil in the air, the same scent she wore on her wedding day. Her chambers were sealed. Coldus didn't speak of it. He didn't have to. The people began calling her the widow of the waking dream Dot. No one knew what it meant, but no one questioned it, because by now, the question was no longer will the king wake. It was, what happens if he does? And as lanterns dimmed across Morvain, as the bell tower was chained shut, and the last echo of the 13th chime curled into memory, the dream deepened. The corridors grew quieter Dot, and in the spaces between footsteps, something old stirred Dot, waiting. In the attic of the Eastern Archive, where roof beams creak like they remember being trees, a single page was found. Not bound, not catalogued, just floating loose inside a rusted ledger labeled Preparations for Coronation. Eden 4. The page didn't belong to that reign Dot. It was newer Dot, and it wasn't to record Dot. It was a list, scrawled into hands, one elegant, slanted, the other sharp, and the pright, each line marked by a pair of initials, Q and C Dot at the top. The title, If He Sleeps Forever. The contents were chilling. Secure borders with Trensmere. Replace court musicians with silent processioners. Preserve voice recordings, 3 copies. Prepare successor narrative, soft reveal. Rename King's Portrait Room 2. Gallery of Light then. This, remove bells. Replace with our glass towers Dot. And finally, no tomb. No mourning, no waking. The archivist who discovered this page delivered it to the in-room keeper of records Dot. The next morning, the archivist was gone. The page filed under seasonal feasts cancelled. Because that's what happens when truth brushes against something deeper than law. It becomes folklore Dot. And this next part, it's the kind of story people tell their children when the moon is too bright and sleep won't come. The Dreamfire night Dot. It started with the wolves, all along the westernwood line. They howled not in hunger, but in pattern, 3 calls, then silence. Then for Dot. Guards heard it, hunters heard it, even the tower cats got up. Then came the smell, not smoke, not rot Dot. Sage, honey Dot. It drifted from the king's chamber, faint, like a memory, one of those olfactory ghosts that grabs the back of your throat and makes you forget what year it is. Coldus was seen entering the chamber just before midnight Dot. Alone Dot. Carrying a small lantern and a cloth bundle. When he emerged, hours later, his robes were scorched at the hem. His hands were blackened with ash Dot. He said nothing, but the chambermaids found the bundle discarded in a fountain. Inside, a single page from the royal hymn book, the one sung only at a monarch's birth, burned nearly through, except for one line. If he sleeps in the sunless hour, let no crown find him there. That same night, in the Queen's abandoned tower, every candle lit itself, witnessed by 3 guards. One fainted, the other 2 fled the palace Dot. By morning, rumors spread like frost that the king's dreams were not passive, that they'd grown large enough to spill beyond his body, that he'd begun to dream of the kingdom itself, its towers, its tunnels, its trembling breath, and those who stepped too close fell into it. There are 4 such cases recorded in secret notes tucked between bread supply ledgers, all for involved servants, all for collapsed mid-step, all for Wokeart muttering. He's listening now. Coldus increased security, but not round the king, round the people. He ordered curfews, quiet hours, replaced city criers with silent lantern-bells at night, instead of songs. Long low bells rang from hidden corners, bells no one had seen in years, bells that hadn't been commissioned by any craftsman alive. One noble woman, Lady Hare, asked him at dinner, "What are we preparing for?" He smiled, very gently, "For a waking that will feel like sleep." And so, the city adapted. Dreams became Quincy. A sacrament. People stopped naming their children after old kings. Books were written in lowercase. Torches were dimmed by Lord. And somewhere, always, just out of sight, Caldus moved like a man walking through water. Not tired. Just deliberate. He no longer read from the reading balcony. He simply stood, and the people looked up and nodded, as if the not speaking meant more than words ever could. Let's end this part in the place where the first oath was spoken, in the deep stone crypt beneath the palace garden. Here lies nothing but dust and echo. But tonight, for the first time in a century, the crypt's single brazier flared back to life, and along the wall, once blank, a phrase had appeared. He is no longer dreaming alone. No coronation was ever announced. No crown lifted. No throne claimed. And yet, by the 14th week of the king's sleep, no one called Caldus a courtier anymore. Even his old enemies, those greying nobles who once mocked his meticulous handwriting and paper bloodline, began greeting him with softened knees and measured eyes. He never corrected them. Didn't need to. Because something subtler had taken hold of the kingdom now. Not fear. Not love. Consensus. The idea that if enough people accept a thing, it becomes true. And the truth was this. Morvain had no king. It had a silence. A long, deep breath held by every wall and window, every cobbled path and open gate. And Caldus, he was the one who decided how long to hold it. Let's drift now through the palace gardens, overgrown, unkempt, once clipped with gold-handled shears, now curling wild with ivy and sleep. Root. In the central fountain once clear. Once musical, the water has gone still, and in that stillness, a sheep, not a reflection, a shimmer. Some say they saw the king's face, smiling. Others say it was Caldus, eyes closed, mouth just slightly open as if breathing someone else's name. Even the statues began to shift, not physically, of course, but ask any groundskeeper, they will tell you. The saint of memory now seems to look toward the west gate, not the library. And the lovers of the first dawn. Their hands are further apart than last spring. Things remember themselves differently now. And in the heart of this softened kingdom, the king's chamber became legend. The door was never opened, not because it was locked, but because everyone agreed not to open it. When food was brought, it was left on the table outside. When linens were changed, they were left folded by the wall. When letters came, yes, people still wrote to him. They were burned at dusk in the hearth of Edran. Caldus said it was symbolic transmission. The people called it whisper posting. Even the children took part. They'd write notes to the king of stillness, slip them into tree hollows, or hide them beneath floorboards. Some wrote apologies, some drew pictures, some just wrote their names, and every so often, a page would be found the next day and signed, unfamiliar, written in Old ink. I see you. What Caldus saw, no one knows. He spoke less now. His robes grew darker, simpler. He stopped wearing the chain of court office and replaced it with a ribbon of woven grey. Historians still argue about that ribbon. Some say it was woven from the queen's abandoned shawl. Others think it came from the hem of the king's coronation robes. Regardless, he wore it every day. And one day, without warning, he disappeared. Not vanished. Just gone. His quarters left open. His ledgers complete. No letter. No blood. Just a single object on his desk. The original crown. Wrought iron. twisted. Heavy as history. Placed on a folded page of blank parchment. The people called it the surrender without sound. That's when things began to unravel, or evolve. Depending on who you ask. The guards outside the king's chamber left their posts. The doors remained closed. Inside. Nothing changed. No noise. No light. But outside, the city began to forget. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just little things. Street names vanished from maps. Coins bore no faces. People gave directions like, turn left where the baker used to be. And when you asked, the baker, they'd blink, you know. The one who never slept. Even the queen's name faded. Her tower was still there. But no one remembered what color her windows were, or whether she had ever truly been crowned. The realm no longer spoke of kings or queens. They spoke of the sleep, as if it were a season, a feast, a tide. And the palace. They renamed it the House of Gentle Hours. Tours were banned, clocks removed. All guests required to walk softly, or not at all. And once a year, on the 13th bell of spring's first moon, someone would place a small bundle of lavender at the chamber door. No one knew who, but the scent would linger for weeks, even in the cellar, even in the crypt. And through all this, the king, still asleep, still dreaming. If he aged, no one saw it. If he dreamed, no one heard. But in the west, beyond Trensmere, strange birds began arriving, gold-feathered, silver-eyed. They didn't sing. They watched. And in the old capital, a child was born with a mark on his palm, a spiral with a line through it. You remember that symbol, don't you, from the chapel door? Historians don't argue about it anymore. They just lower their voices, because now, even debate might be an invitation. Let's end this section quietly. The king sleeps. The kingdom waits. The world outside has learned to speak slowly, in case he's listening. And in the silence, we wonder, who wakes first, the sleeper or the dream? The sun rose sideways on the day it happened. Not metaphorically, though, of course. Metaphor has a habit of following history like a nervous younger sibling, but literally, the eastern sky glowed red, and the shadows didn't behave. They stretched not east to west, but northward, toward the old orchard. That was the first sign. The second, the birds stopped flying. Not dead, not even afraid, just still, perched, as if someone had pressed pause. And in the palace of Morvain, every clock stopped at the same time, for 17 and no chimes, no clicks, just one long moment where time decided it was no longer the kingdom's servant. And at the center of it, the chamber door opened. No one opened it. It simply was. There was no sound, no wind, no cry of he wakes from the parapets, just the quiet hush of silk brushing stone as the king hair grayed at the temples. Eyes closed but breathing deep, walked out. Yes, walked, fully clothed in the robes he hadn't worn since the festival of the moons, crownless, shoeless, silent. He passed the guards, those who still remained. They bowed, not in duty. In awe. Then he walked the length of the mirrorless corridor, past the obsidian panels, which reflected not his face, but the faces of those who had waited, the queens, Calduses, 100 unnamed ones. And just behind him, visible only in those warped reflections, a crowd of shadows walked to. Not ghosts, not spirits. Ideas. Echoes of choices not made. He reached the great hall, stopped beneath the rose-glass stone, looked up as the dawn finally cracked through the colored panes. Then he spoke 3 words, the only words anyone remembered. Was it enough? And then, the strangest thing, he sat on the steps, not the throne, the steps, and rested his hands in his lap. No one moved. The bells did not ring. The birds remained silent. Dot, and then the palace exhaled. A real soundstone shifting, mortar settling, tapestries fluttering in a breeze no one felt. After that, nothing. He didn't speak again, didn't sleep, didn't leave. He just remained. Dot present. Observed. Dot, and slowly the people adjusted. Children were brought to see him, not as king, not as ruler, but as the sleeper who woke. They offered him stories, drawings, questions. Dot, he answered none. But when a boy with a crooked tooth handed him a toy sword made of twigs, the king took it gently, tapped it once on the stone. The boy smiled for 3 days. The city changed again. Dot, no thrones now, no crowns, no titles. Dot, only keepers of hours, of bread, of silence. The palace became a place of stillness, of learning, of quiet rituals. Some say Caldis was seen once more, not near the king, near the orchard, planting something. Dot, it bloomed the following spring, a flower that hadn't grown in the kingdom for centuries. Its name, whispered. When asked what it was, the gardener said, "Something you only find when you stop asking." The queen, she returned once. Dot, to leave a scar on the king's shoulder. He didn't look at her. Dot, but he placed his hand over it. "Let's dim the lights now. Soften the edges. You're tired. That's all right. Because some stories don't end with a kiss or a war or a lesson. Some stories end like this. A man wakes, the world waits. And in that hutch, everything becomes new again. And that, dear listener, is where we leave it. Dot, not with a sword raised high, not with a crown on someone's head, not even with the curtain falling. Exactly. Dot, just with a breath, a long, soft, steady breath. Because that's what Morvain became, a kingdom where people learned to live in the quiet, where titles were traded for presents, where no one chased prophecy anymore, because they'd learned how dangerous it is to wake someone too soon. You might still hear whispers, if you visit the ruins now, of a king who sat so still that time bowed to him. Dot, of a courtier who tried to carry a kingdom on parchment and silence, of a queen who disappeared without leaving but managed, somehow, to be remembered in flowers and wind. Historians still debate whether it was betrayal or sacrifice, whether Caldis seized power, or simply filled a shape that had been hollow for years, whether the king let himself sleep, or whether something older pulled him under. But honestly, none of that matters anymore, because history, like dreams, is most honest in the moments no one records. And somewhere, beneath a palace no longer guarded by names or clocks, the chair still sits empty, a crown gathers dust in a fountain, and the king maybe still watches, or remembers, or just listens. So now, turn off the lights. Let the silence stretch just a little longer. Let your breath slow down. Dot, and if you dream tonight, let it be soft, let it be long, and let it remind you that not every ending needs an answer. Some just need quiet. Good night.